Spiritual enlightenment is one of the most elusive ideas in our lives. Nobody actually knows what it is, apart from a few people who are indeed enlightened. We don't know who they are, as we don't know what enlightenment is, and whether those people are honest or not, after all. If they are truly enlightened, they don't talk about it, as there is no need for that, or it's simply indescribable. We could even say that every attempt to explain enlightenment or talk about it is rude or presumptuous. Maybe it is, but sometimes we simply are too curious and bold to do such things. As we progressively advance on our spiritual awakening paths, our soul essence begins to blossom like a luminous flower deep in our hearts. The more we clear away the dead, gnarled, and overgrown beliefs, perspectives, and emotional baggage within us, the more clearly we feel our divine essence or true nature. Below, I want to share with you 11 of the most common traps that we fall into on the spiritual path. Spiritual bypassing means using spirituality to dodge tough emotions or situations. Examples include ignoring feelings, being overly positive, avoiding anger, having weak boundaries, or being overly tolerant at one's expense. It can also involve trying to squash the ego, being overly detached, or sticking to rigid beliefs. The trap of superiority is feeling like you're better than others who aren't as spiritual. Sometimes it leads to being mean to those who aren't as aware or calling them names like asleep or sheep. This happens especially when someone has just started understanding things but hasn't grown spiritually much yet. We should remember that everyone is trying their best at their own pace, and they'll understand things when they're ready. Once we have awoken out of the matrix, it's common for us to desperately want our loved ones and fellow peers to awaken. We can see how much pain and delusion other people are in, and that riles up in us the intense desire to show them the truth. However, often our attempt to forcefully awaken people misfires quickly. Even though we have good intentions, our desire to save others causes them to backlash in ways that infuriate both them and us. The less responsive they are to our pushy attempts to wake them up, the more frustrated and alienated we become. This trap is closely entwined with the previous trap, except it is more geared toward giving others advice. There's nothing wrong with wanting to help others, as long as you respect their personal boundaries. But sometimes developing an expanded spiritual perspective gives the ego an opportunity to feel more knowledgeable than others still trapped in illusion. When unsolicited advice is given to others, the results can be disastrous. Wanting to help others can also be used as a way of escaping our need to help ourselves. Under the guise of being spiritual and compassionate, helping others can be just another form of spiritual bypassing. Once we wake up to the lies and corruption present in our current societal structure, many of us want to desperately change society. However, all too often, many of us fall into the trap of thinking that freedom, honesty, and justice can be created by changing the external system. As a result, we buy into the yes versus them and divide and conquer mentality that is a product of the ego's tunnel vision. We don't realize that we're actually fueling the corrupt system, which depends on anger and chaos to thrive and survive. Instead of understanding that all true change comes from an internal revolution, we get caught up in the pursuit of external revolution, which is fragile and transient. Once we experience divine and transcendent states of being in which we become one with all, we can fall into the trap of spiritual nihilism after the experience passes. In other words, once we realize from the perspective of the universe that nothing we do ultimately matters because all is passing, we can fall into a depressive mindset. Some people get so infatuated with the spiritual path that they avoid dealing with ordinary, everyday affairs. This form of escapism can lead to leeching off others, not paying bills, evading taxes, and obsessing with living off the grid. When avoiding everyday responsibilities is worn as a badge of being consciously elevated or more spiritual, this too is a form of egotism in disguise. Avoiding ordinary responsibilities which are not perceived as being spiritual enough can also be a form of distraction that the ego uses to limit spiritual growth. The more concerned and obsessed you are with living an outwardly spiritual-looking life, the more distanced from your inner work you become. After we experience a spiritual awakening or Kundalini awakening and wake up to the insanity of the world, it is common for us to get stuck in a pattern of self-victimization. We may start to perceive the world as a prison and other people as the captives or even capturers. The shock of awakening may send us spiraling into anxiety and paranoia. Inevitably, we may start feeling like victims, resulting in us blaming other people and the higher powers for how we feel. The savior complex happens when people think they're better than everyone else and believe it's their job to save the world. It's common among those who see themselves as spiritual or healers and think they're on a mission to fix everything. They might feel like there's something wrong with the world and that they're the only ones who can fix it, which can make their egos get really big. After having big spiritual moments, we often get really into them. But then, when we go back to normal life, it can be hard. We might hold on to those experiences tightly. We also cling to our ideas about spirituality to try to understand what happened. But the more we hold on to these thoughts and beliefs, the more we suffer. We forget that everything, even big spiritual moments, eventually goes away. Enlightenment isn't about reaching a goal. It's about letting go completely and changing how we see life. True freedom comes when we stop holding on to our thoughts and who we think we are. As we progress through our spiritual paths, it is normal and beneficial for us to seek out external support. Reading books, attending workshops and seminars, going to retreats, practicing holistic techniques, and getting a personal guru all help us experience spiritual growth. However, after a while, it is common for us to become too dependent on external answers for our freedom and happiness. Eventually, as we become accustomed to constantly searching outside of ourselves for answers, we forget the presence of our own souls. We forget that our ultimate source of guidance and wisdom comes from within us, and instead, we keep chasing things outside of ourselves that we believe will enlighten us. In order to see through and extricate ourselves from these spiritual traps, we need to be radically honest with ourselves. We need to be willing to see whereabouts we have indeed gone astray and have fed into the ego. We will also immensely benefit from exploring our shadow self and exploring our mistaken beliefs during this process. Don't worry if you have fallen into any of these spiritual traps. We all become ensnared by the ego. It can be particularly difficult for us to see clearly when the ego spiritualizes certain beliefs and ideas. The more open, humble, and honest you are, the more you will be able to see through these tricks and liberate yourself. Finally, don't be afraid of the dark. Don't be afraid of being wrong. Everything, no matter how painful, is a learning opportunity. At the end of the day, your soul contains everything you have been searching for. Thanks for watching this video and see you next time.